So Patrick Armstrong is a licensed marriage and family therapist. He's in private practice with Sonoma Family Therapy Group. Prior to Sonoma Family Therapy Group, he practiced in nonprofit agencies working with underserved populations. Patrick's last agency was Social Advocates for Youth. Patrick is an alumnus of SSU, obtaining his BA in psychology in 1987 and MA in counseling psychology in 2009. He works with teens, adults, and elders. Patrick works with clients in a wide range of issues, but his passion is working with the LGBTQ population, especially around gender issues. As a specialty, Patrick helps clients with gender identity, sexual and romantic attraction, HIV/AIDS, and sex-related issues, including BDSM, kink, polyamory, and more. Patrick is on the Trans Life Conference Planning Committee, which is celebrating its 3rd year. Patrick regularly speaks in college classes and does presentations on LGBTQ-related issues, and he's available for consultations. Welcome, Patrick.
Thank you, Erica. How many of you filled out the questions? Some of you? Good. Thought-provoking? Make you think a little bit? I hope so. Today is International World AIDS Day, actually. So, we went through quite a mess back in the 80s with AIDS. And that is actually where I became an activist. As an adult. I would say that I was an activist when I was a kid. My parents taught me to be socially active, to fight for rights, to do things that were socially conscious. And I came out as an adult, a young adult, right at the beginning of the AIDS epidemic. And there was a need for us, for some of us to speak up and be leaders and fight for rights, to be out there speaking, to be part of awareness groups, that kind of thing. There was the Russian River AIDS Awareness Group that was starting around that time, and I was one of the many members out there. And 4 of us spun off, and we started the Santa Rosa AIDS Awareness Group. And that eventually merged with the Russian River AIDS Awareness Group and became the group that everybody should probably know today, called the Face-to-Face. So I was part of that way back in the very beginning. Over time, I moved to San Francisco and I began doing things. But through all of these years, even starting as a little kid, one of the many things I've always done is stand up in front of groups and talk about whatever I was so passionate about from a social conscious standpoint. By the way, I have a tremor, so if I shake a little bit, it's the tremor, not me nervous. Sometimes people come up to me after a presentation and go, "Oh, you were so wonderful, you didn't need to be nervous." No. It's totally fine. So let's just take a moment of pause. Help if I turn this thing on. Just for the World AIDS Day. I'm curious how many of you know who the 2 people are that I chose there. You haven't seen them in the news for a really long time. The top one is Ryan White. He was the poster boy for kids who were getting HIV/AIDS from blood transfusions. He was 18 when he died. The bottom one was a modern pop singer. His name was Sylvester. He was from San Francisco area. That's Sylvester. That's Sylvester. I actually got to meet Sylvester a lot. I went out to what was then the Armstrong Woods resort that was just outside of Armstrong Woods when it existed in those days. And I was one of the very few people that wasn't part of his entourage that he actually allowed to get near him because I didn't glong all over him. I just happened to be nearby and he would chat me up a lot. I really enjoyed it. So how many of you are comfortable talking about gender and fluidity? Or attraction and fluidity? Do you feel you're really comfortable with that? Do you think you really understand it and can work with the kids nowadays? Because I have to tell you, these kids today are so different than our generations sitting in this room, especially the older you are, because we're so set on binary. It's what we were taught. And I bet that you, when you think about it, it's kind of difficult to change how you perceive things, isn't it? It's hard to make that shift when you see somebody. You get stuck going, right? Let's look at something. What do you see? You don't need to tell me right away. Just famous picture. What do you see? Don't need to speak out for a second, but you know this one. Okay? Right. And what do you see there? Now, if I ask you to bounce back and forth between the images, switch between the young woman and the old man, or old woman and the young woman, sorry, between the vases and the two faces, it's hard to make that switch back and forth, isn't it? But eventually, over time, you can do it.
Even harder to see them both simultaneously.
Right. Because we're conditioned to try to see a pattern, and it's hard to switch that pattern. We're conditioned by society to see male-female. We're conditioned by society to see homosexual, heterosexual. But the kids today are saying, screw that. We don't want male-female. We don't want heterosexual, homosexual. We want to throw away all those labels. Just get rid of them. We don't want them. Why do we need to look across the room and say, look, that woman in the red dress? Why can't it be that person coat? It's what we're taught. Because here's the interesting part. Let's go back around the 1400s. That would have been a man in the red dress. We go back around the 1900s. Pink was a common color for men. Blue was for women, and I'm talking babies. Pink was for baby boys. Blue was for baby girls. The fashion industry needed to up their sales, so they flipped the colors in the early 40s. 1940s, yeah. In the 1940s, they flipped the colors to boost sales, and suddenly all the boys needed to wear blue, and all the girls needed to wear pink. And that's where we got it today. It hasn't been there all along. And to this day, by the way, if you notice royal pictures of the British royal family, all the little boys, when they're born, up until a certain age, have to still wear dresses. Because that's their tradition. That's their code. So I want to get a couple things out of the way because we have to for all these presentations. For CEs, we have to talk about the competencies. Oh, wait a minute. Before I get to that, let's talk about what's in the presentation. Because there's going to be a lot in this presentation for you to look at that I'm not going to be touching on today, but it's important for you to know. So download the presentation, okay? We're going to be touching on what's on the right side. And then accompanying the presentation, I have some handouts that'll be in the zip file. I want to remind you of a couple dates because I can't teach you everything here. We can go on and on and on and on. But there is a professional symposium coming up April 28th for licensed professionals, okay? Keep that in mind. 7 CEs, breakfast and lunch. We also have for any of your clients, March 3rd, we have the community conference, okay? And I want to assure you, we've got 6 professionals sitting on the committee putting it together to ensure it's put together right. 3 of them highlighted, Leslie Hansen, Chris Spangler, and myself here in the RECAMFT. So we've got a lot of us on that committee putting it together. Let's talk. Are you going to be sending out more updated? We're going to update the flyer. She was asking about the bookmarks that we put out for reminders. We're updating them so that they're a lot nicer. The bookmarks for the community conference are actually going to be postcards with Spanish English to make it easier for everybody. And we've already updated. We still are updating the one for the professional symposium because Suji Tarmamatis, Dr. Suji Tarmamatis, She started the trans health clinic here with Santa Rosa Community Health Centers back, oh boy, 8-9 years ago. Gus, do you remember when she started? Or Buzz, do you remember when she started it? No. I think it was like 8 years ago, 9 years ago. She's not doing it anymore, but she's also the founder of the Trans Life Conference. So let's talk about mental health professional, the competencies. Sorry, this thing keeps sliding on my head. There are 2 organizations that actually talk about the competencies for working with transgender and LGBTQ community. The first one is the World Professional Association of Transgender Health. And these are the competencies for working with transgender individuals. These also this particular list translates over to LGBT as well. These are the ones that you would obviously think of: master's degree, competency in the DSM, ability to recognize coexisting mental health concerns, but in this particular case, being able to differentiate it from gender dysphoria. Many people make mistakes in diagnosing and misdiagnosing gender dysphoria when it isn't there, or diagnosing other mental health disorders when it's actually gender dysphoria. You really need to understand the nuances. And when there are coexisting with gender dysphoria as well. Obviously, documented, supervised, knowledgeable in gender nonconforming identities and expression. That's what we're doing here a little bit. Continuing education, workshops, all that kind of stuff. We're doing it right now. In addition to that, it's recommended that you maintain cultural competence to facilitate your work. It's also strongly encouraged that you get involved in your community. If you're really going to work with transgender and LGBT individuals, you really should be involved in the community, working with the community organizations that work directly with the LGBT community. We've got Positive Images, we've got LGBTQ Connection, we've got the group that Buzz talked about, we've got a couple other organizations. If you really are going to work with work with those particular clientele, that's where you need to be doing some of your work as well. By the way, the acronyms that you'll see from time to time, they're going to change on slides, because those are the acronyms used by whatever I'm quoting. So working with LGBTQQ, same thing. In this case, look at this a little bit more. How many of you all said that you were comfortable working with, talking about gender fluidity, talking about sexual attraction and being fluid? How many of you think about heterosexism, or biphobia, transphobia, homophobia, homoprejudice? Does that come up for you when you're working with your clients? Do you remember those things?
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
So I don't think that I have a problem bringing it up, but I'm concerned that I'm not able to read or don't know my client well enough yet, that where they may have a response or a reaction to me bringing it up. So I want to be more skillful in asking those questions.
So I heard you right that you said that you're comfortable working with the client, but you're not sure that... How did you ask that? You're not sure how to get it out of your client?
I'm not sure when to ask the question.
Which question are you asking? You're not sure what to ask the question.
Dysphoria. Mm-hmm. Let's say a skillful way to bring that up.
Well, so he asked when to ask the skillful question about gender dysphoria. My very first question to you is, when during your intake process did you ever ask the question about their gender identity? Yeah. When in any of you, when you do your intakes, do you ever take the time to ask your client, what is your gender? How do you identify? When at any time during your intake process do you ask your clients how they identify with their attractions? If you're not asking those questions up front, you're missing the boat. And I'll tell you that the two reasons that LGBT clients leave their therapists are because their therapists completely ignore or avoid LGBT issues in the room. It may be because they're completely ignorant, they didn't ask the questions, or because they're not skillful and they focus too much on them. It's like, ooh, give me the details, tell me that story. Ooh, I want to know about that, educate me. Ooh, I want to get into that. Let's disregard this other issue. And if you're not asking the questions, you're going to fall in that first category, why that client walks out the door, and you'll never know that that client left because they identified LGBT. You'll just think they stopped coming.
So I think one simple thing to do, because I have it on my intake, I say, how do you identify? And I don't give them choices, I just leave it. But I also say, what pronouns are you comfortable with?
Yeah.
And so so many people who are, genderqueer, non-binary, may have a name that seems like it might be one gender or the other. When you ask them the pronouns, I'll kind of give you whether they say he or she or them or they, or there's a few other variations out there. And so that's, I find sometimes particularly often, because they, in our language, is usually meant as a plural, but there's a number of people who use that. So instead of saying she, I would say they. Sometimes it can sound okay, but sometimes it just gets really confusing, and that's a hard one to kind of relearn. But I think if you can put that like on your intake, like I do, you're already, I think sometimes it's really simple things that you don't think of. Like on an intake form, if I see, that's how I word it, but I was doing something for like a massage therapist or something the other last week, and they said, what's your gender, male or female? And, I can answer that because my gender, I'm comfortable, my gender is a female, but I wrote a little comment to them suggesting that they give another alternative there. So automatically, you give these signals, without even realizing it. And so what I would say to you is what Patrick's saying in terms of that's automatically signaling to somebody your comfort level, or something I haven't had in my email signature, but I keep needing to add. Some people now in their email signatures add the gender, the pronouns.
Right.
And even the fact that you add that says you have some consciousness of it, and therefore an assumption you might be a safe person to talk to.
I totally agree. For the sake of the recording, what Karen was talking about was to make sure that your forms are inclusive when you're asking questions about gender, that kind of thing. You can either just ask the question, what gender do you identify, and leave it that way. You can also ask questions like, give suggestions, male, female, non-binary, etc. It opens the door for them. You can ask about attraction. When I worked in agencies, I had my own form I used, and I had them fill out. Now I use a much more organic, because I take a few sessions to ask questions out. Each person has a different way to do it. I vary it a little bit. One common way would be, as I'm getting through, I would say, I have some more questions I need to ask that I ask everybody. Tell me how you identify your gender. Tell me how you identify your pronouns. Tell me how you identify who you're attracted to, and then I draw out of them. I don't make assumptions. I'll slip. I take that back. We all make assumptions, and I'm going to slip and use a pronoun before I get all the answers I want. I try my best not to make that mistake. Make sense? But we really have to be careful, and we're going to have to make some changes coming up. But I want to go back to this. How many of you, when you're working with your clients, remember to put on your cultural competency? I bet you when you're working with somebody who is a minority, you remember to put on, I have that one question, number 9. Look at question number 9 and answer that for just a moment, since we're sitting on competencies right now. How many of you would remember to think, hey, okay, so let's say that you didn't, let's say that Talia's Caucasian. Talia's being bullied at school. You forgot to ask the questions about gender. You forgot to ask the questions about her being, what she's attracting. And she's being bullied at school. And you're completely missing the boat to look at a cultural competency that maybe it has to do with the fact that she's gender fluid. Maybe it has to do with the fact it has to do with her attraction. And you don't even know to put that lens on because you didn't ask the questions. Or maybe you did ask the questions, but you're forgetting to put the lens on in the room because you're not used to putting the lens on in the room. And it goes back to what I was saying, that so many times people are leaving therapy because the therapist says, I'm comfortable working with LGBT. But so many leave because the therapist forgets to put the cultural competency lens on. That makes sense? Okay, it's just we have to bring more awareness. The reason is 12% of youth today identify transgender, or not, correction, they identify gender fluid. That's huge. Recognize stigma, prejudice, discrimination. It basically goes back to the other. And the pressures that to be heterosexual. The pressures are huge to be heterosexual, to be binary, male, female. And know that normative development of the youth is different. If you are non-binary gender and you're homo and you don't identify heterosexual, your development with your gender, your development around your attraction starts much later because you're trying so hard to be the binary that your development starts later. For some people, it doesn't truly start till adulthood because it's stunted for a long time. And we have to keep that in mind when we're working with everybody. We also have to remember to look at identity confusion goes on for a long time there. And we have to be thinking about that. If this client's confused, they may not be bringing up attraction as an issue. But they haven't been dating anybody? There might be something there. We might have to look at that. You know, a lot of times we look at it and say it's social anxiety, but if they're not dating anybody, you better be looking at attraction and gender issues. Suicidal ideation, it's huge. Academic failure. You got somebody failing in school? You need to go looking. I would go looking at that. I know Karen talked about that a bit too. Physical, sexual, verbal abuse, homelessness. Homelessness is really large. Prostitution with a person, somebody who's transgender, 4 times more likely to be a prostitute. One of the statistics I don't have up there, a person who identifies transgender 10 times more likely to be murdered. Okay, so we understand, right? This just talks about looking at the socioeconomic. Socioeconomic is very different for LGBTQ versus somebody who's heteronormative and gender binary. Just let you look at that for a second. And then I want to ask yourself, what, huh?
It was not long enough.
Okay, fine, I'll go back. I'll let you have more time on it. No. This comes from the Alliance for, oh, forget it, never mind. I was going to say the name of the group, but I always stumble over their name. It's the LGBTQIC. It's a counseling organization it's part of American Counseling Association. It's one of their subsidiaries. And so ask yourself, what is your experience level working with individuals who identify transgender nonconforming? Have you worked with a lot of clients? Bigger question is, did you know you were working with some of them and didn't realize it because you didn't ask the right questions? Individuals who identify lesbian, gay, bisexual. How about non-monogamous relationships in an affirming manner? Thank you, Karen, for your presentation. Unique relationship issues. There are unique relationship issues. Socioeconomic issues. Again, educating yourself. Do you believe open relationships can be successful? The LGBTQ community is a lot more open to those relationships. They throw away the normative. Do you believe gender identity can be fluid? A lot of people are still saying no. Do you believe that sexual and romantic attraction can be fluid? We've been taught for years no. And do you have any moral beliefs that get in the way? Some people do. Just things to think about. So those are basically the competence. Now we go back to trusting. This is a big question to ask yourself. Do you select gay, lesbian questioning on the Counseling California? I know people who are LGBT, no problem. I'll select that. But think what I've already been talking about. If you really don't know all the cultural competencies, you've got people walking out the door because the questions weren't asked and you didn't realize. And so I want you to think about, if you've got that ticked, should it really be ticked on there? Because I bet there's other things you don't check on there because you don't feel comfortable do it. So go back and look at that and see if you really should turn that off or not. Just something to think about. I just want you to think.
I've seen several great presentations from images.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things that one of the things that's constantly emphasized is that the view is shifting continually.
Yes.
So the statistics that we have today may not matter tomorrow.
Right.
So how do you say, oh, I think I know it? How do you get to a place where, is it a matter of constantly,
She was saying that she was saying that she's been to a lot of workshops and presentations put on by Positive Images, and that the views are constantly changing. Absolutely. And it goes back to what I was already talking about. Continued education. Continue. Jennifer's seen my old presentations. Maybe one or two of you have too, from several years ago. This is vastly different from then, because views have changed since then. And my presentation then was very progressive. But things have changed dramatically even since then. And I do presentations on an ongoing basis, and it takes me many hours to put my presentation together because I update them every time I do my presentation. That's how fluid things are. So yeah, it really is staying on top of it. It's that fluid. Microphone, yeah.
Can you recommend a good website that sort of up-to-date info?
Yes, I would look on my referral list that will be part of the presentation online. When this is posted online, there's going to be a vast referral list. And I would just simply go that way, or you can email me because there's so many. Huh? You don't have a favorite that you can go to? You could go to the American Counseling Association's, what is it? Jan, do you remember how the whole acronym goes, ALGBT, or how it spells out? They have a subsidiary of the American Counseling Association, and I'll be darned if I can spell it out every time. Hold on just a sec. It is a subsidiary, and they have phenomenal information. The Association for Lesbian, Gay, Bisexual, and Transgender Issues in Counseling. There we go. They have an excellent site for information. I would also look at sites like the Human Rights Campaign, the GLAAD has information. Of all things, I would look at the CDC. You would be amazed at the phenomenal information you can find on the CDC and how accurate it is. I just cannot tell you how impressed I am. Okay, 34% of people, all ages, will hide the information from you when they come in that door. Ages 16 to 24, 44 to 49% will hide that information from you unless you ask the right questions. Why do you think they might hide that information from you? That's the big part to get to. Why do you think they hide? Right. Tara said because they might think you're one of the oppressors. And that is completely right. They don't trust you. They're afraid. They're afraid they're going to tell you and you're going to tell somebody else. And it's going to hurt them in some way. Most common, I've already mentioned them. Is what we already talked about. I already mentioned those two. That's why I skipped over it so quickly. Yeah.
The thing about hiding, it's not that they might hide it from us, but they're hiding it from themselves.
No, I'm talking only hiding from the professionals. I'm not talking hiding from themselves. I'm only talking hiding from professionals. Yeah. So I want to touch on this lightly. There's a lot of different ways to do this. This is going to be super simplistic, okay? And I mean super simplistic. And the only reason I'm bringing it up very quickly is to get you to think that we have to be careful how we address our clients. Because another common reason built in there is clients get offended when we don't address them correctly. And also people get very confused what to do in their notes. So I just want to touch on it very quickly. In a professional setting, a lot of times we need to have information for legal. We need their legal name, we need their legally assigned gender, and we need their date of birth. Your records should also show their name of choice, their identified gender, and their pronouns used. Question for you. One of the big things coming up, one of your questions on there, number one, who knows what passed on October 15? That's a good way to put it. She said change on driver's license. It's more than that. It's the Gender Recognition Act, and what that will do is that starting January 1st, 2019, we will have a third gender in California, non-binary. Get your records ready for it. You'll have to start referring to your clients using a third gender. I invite you to start doing it a lot sooner.
What is it again? What's the third gender?
Non-binary. Yeah. So your insurance companies and everybody have to catch up very quickly. The nice thing about it is that they're going to be able to do things a lot more quickly. This will affect driver's license, state-issued IDs, and birth certificates. I know that they are working very quickly for Social Security and for the passports to do something like this as well, because more and more municipalities are doing something. So we should see something very soon there. The nice thing about it is that it used to be to change your gender on documents, you had to be 18 or over. That limit is gone. It'll only require one parent to sign to change the gender on somebody under 18. And one thing I really, 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 really love is if the other parent contests, they have to go to court and justify why. And it's going to be very difficult for them to prove why not to change the gender. Starting January 1st, they will no longer have to consult with professionals to prove that it's okay to change gender. And starting January 1st, that'll just be for male, female. Starting January 1st, 2019, it'll be for the three. But they're going to do away with having to come to a therapist or to a doctor to get a document to take to DMV. It's going away. I love what we did. And they're doing away with the requirement to be under treatment, clinically appropriate treatment. Who has an idea what that means by clinically appropriate treatment? It's an interesting statement. Basically, it means they're under hormone treatment or they've gone through some kind of a surgery. Yeah, it's very hard, but on occasion they'll do it if if a therapist says, this person really truly identifies the opposite gender and I truly believe it, but they don't want to do hormones, then they might get it. Yeah, what's your question?
What if there was something about birth certificates? When a baby's born?
Oh yeah, birth certificates change all the time. You can actually, under certain circumstances, go back and change your name on your birth certificate. But you can change your gender on the birth certificate. It happens all the time.
When the baby's born, you identify by whatever your top gender is.
Correct. When a baby's born, you identify on there the gender that the doctor tells you. That's how it's identified. I'll get to that in a minute. But then the person can later go back and change to match whatever they identify later. Yeah.
Otherwise, how do you know? Either that or you just don't put gender.
Right. No, it's quite interesting. I'll talk about that in a minute. Okay, let's look very quickly at this. Just as an example, Harry Rogers, legal name. She goes by Meredith. So in your records, you should be putting it as Harry, parentheses, Meredith Rogers, okay? That's how it should appear in your records. You probably already know this. That's why I'm just doing it very quickly. But this is how it should appear. You need to recognize Meredith, period. You should also recognize the legal gender because that's needed for your insurance. If you're not doing insurance, use their gender of choice on your records. Pronouns used. If the pronouns are not matching their legal gender, please put their pronouns, because if you're ever audited by insurance or something, they're going to confuse. They're going to look at you and if you're doing Medi-Cal for the county, oh my God, you better make sure those pronouns are noted somewhere. They'll look at it and say, what's going on here? So I ran into that a lot.
A little bit, you're saying that a client who identifies as female, but is otherwise male on some documentation, legal documentation. In my documents, if I refer to them in third person, I should be using the client's preferred pronoun?
Always. Always.
But then I would have to note, client has expressed preference for...
Not expressed preference, client uses.
Uses. Okay.
It's not a preference, it's who they are.
Then what do you mean by insurance that you have?
On very rare occasions, an insurance might ask you some very specific information, and they just need to see. And I was referring as much to, say, county Medi-Cal. Very few of you take that, but sometimes they require an audit and they'll look, and if that's off, they get upset. They'll see, well, wait a minute, it says male there. Why are you referring to she? They get that picky. Don't ask me why. And it's just good rule of thumb. If you're ever audited, if you're ever called to question through the BBS or through the courts, they'll want to know that you're accurate if you're ever subpoenaed. So just make a note right at the very beginning, client uses pronouns. Bam. And from then on, use those pronouns. So what do you do when the client changes pronouns? Client uses, bam, continue using. That simple. Always use their pronouns that they identify, never the pronouns that match their legal. You need to note their legal if you need it for insurance purposes, that kind of thing. But only ever use the pronouns they identify. And we used to say preferred pronouns. We're moving away from that because, quite frankly, it's not a preferred identity, so why do we use preferred pronoun? It is their pronoun of choice, but it really matches their identities. That's why we're moving away from that word. Make sense? No, okay, yeah, that's okay.
You can be trans and identify as a woman or a man, depending on where you went, or they. So.
Or Z or Zir or any number of about 30 some odd. Yeah.
Choosing your pronoun. It is your preferred pronoun.
Yes, but the way that she's saying that you do choose the pronoun because there's like 30 some odd, and you're choosing your identity, and that's kind of right. It's just it's a semantic in the community, the way they're looking at it, because the pronouns are kind of a way to look at which identity they identify as. Is why we're moving away from the word preferred pronoun. You're looking like you're starting to say something. Okay, never mind. I just right. Yeah, it implies. Yeah, exactly. She said it's kind of like saying preferred sexuality implies age. It implies something that isn't. Yeah.
But then what if the person who's gender fluid prefers they? And that really gets confusing for anybody who's reading the notes. Who are we talking about then?
Well, you just have to be careful in your notes. But they is the correct word. And here's the interesting part, language-wise, we often say they are. Did you realize that in the English language, technically you should be saying they is? If we go back to Old English on that, because they is being used singular. If you ever hear anybody ever tell you otherwise, they're actually not using English correctly. And I have to be careful in my own notes to say they is.
So they is a plural pronoun. They is a plural pronoun, but if you're using it as a singular pronoun, you would use a singular.
Correct. Old English, they used to be in Old English, they was a singular pronoun for neutral. You had a question way over there.
It's not a question, but a comment. I've run into this a few times, and because my English background doesn't want to let me use they,
It's not a choice.
Everybody, the client. The client is blah, blah, blah. Client is this, client is that. And client is not gendered, and it's not, it's not anything except that this particular client is doing this, that, or the other. So it helps keep me in the singular, and
If you can move away from pronouns, fantastic. But sometimes we end up using pronouns so we don't end up with 3 or 4 words to make it easier. So.
They and he, she, they, but all three.
No, never. That actually becomes offensive. She asks, why don't we put he, she, they? That actually becomes offensive because we're not honoring their pronoun.
Not to mention the music too.
Oh, absolutely. We're not.
There are things you can do in terms of offending somebody. What's the references like to their birth name or What dead names would consider what?
Dead names?
You're talking about also looking at name. I think what you're talking about is when we make a mistake and refer to their former name constantly. There's a term used if we continually refer to a person's former name. It's called dead naming. That's no longer their name. And it actually, we have to act like it never really existed unless we're writing legal documents. And it's very offensive.
So once a client legally changes the documentation, we can drop the Harry.
Yes, exactly. Once somebody changes their legal name, you just drop the former name from your records and put the new name in legally, just like you would if somebody marries.
Would we do that? Like, if they'd seen you for a year and then they changed everything, would you go back?
What would you do if the person changed? Would you go backwards? No, because they were legally that in the past, and your records reflect the change going forward. So just summarizing, which name do you use talking about my client? Name of choice. Which pronouns should I use when I'm talking about my client? Pronouns my client uses. I don't know what pronouns my client uses. Ask. Always, 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 always. Never assume. Make that a part of your intake. Always ask. You would be surprised. There are members in this group that do not use binary, and yet you refer to them using binary. My client just told me they're using a name and pronouns. What do I do? Document the changes in the records. Use the new name and pronouns. We just talked about that. Make sense? Okay, I want to try to move on. Oh, here we go. What happens when I make a mistake? Brief apology. Move on quickly. Assess why you keep making the mistake. That's on you, not on the client. And work diligently on not making the mistake. It completely falls on you. It's 100% on you. Okay, let's switch gears. Gender and attraction.